To begin this exercise, you should have downloaded the basic vector shapes Adobe Illustrator file and also have already finished the custom brushes exercise. We're going to be using some of the custom brushes that you created from this exercise within the basic vector shapes exercise. So without finishing that, this one should be done first. So to get started, let's double click and open up the basic vector shapes Illustrator file. And you can see this is set up in several different artboards. We're going to be testing out some different techniques on the circles at the top, and then you can fill in and practice on the rest of the shapes down at the bottom. To load up your custom brushes that you've already created, let's go ahead and open up the brushes panel. If you don't see the brushes, looks like I've accidentally clicked on the wrong one, you can always go up to Window and choose Brushes from the drop-down menu. And that should automatically open it. There it is down there. I'm going to click and drag this off just so I can see it by itself. Now to load your brushes onto there, click on the options at the top right-hand corner and choose Open Brush Library. And then from here, choose Other Library. This will allow you to find the Adobe Illustrator file that we already have saved. Notice that this opens it up in the Illustrator Brushes folder, so let's navigate to the folder that you know where your brushes are saved. In my case, I've got it in the basic vector, and here's my Ivy's Custom Brushes folder, and we'll say Open. And notice that when you do this, this will open up all of your custom brushes that we created in its own separate panel and palette. From here, you can close out your other brushes, and let's just keep this one open. I'm going to drag it off from the other ones that we have. And now we can pull from these and start to use these. Next, let's open up our Appearances panel. We'll go up to Window, down to Appearance. And inside the Appearance panel, this is where we can customize the look and feel of everything. But also, let's open up the options for this and make sure New Art has Basic Appearance is unchecked, the way this is unchecked. So if yours is already checked on, simply select it to uncheck this. This way everything you create will have the same appearance as you start to build out your objects. Once you're finished, we can place this and dock it back over here. We won't be needing that or using that for the rest of this exercise. Finally, let's navigate over and locate our regular paintbrush tool, and we can double click on this tool to open up the options, and you can set your options to whatever you feel most comfortable. I'm just going to keep mine the default fidelity, but make sure Fill New Strokes is unchecked and Keep Selected is also unchecked for what we're doing here. We'll say OK to that. The first object we're going to work on is going to be this green circle. Now, when you do paintings in Adobe Illustrator, there's several different ways you can think about it. The first is the most basic way of doing a painting. That's simply painting on top of whatever object that you're working on. You can think of this as the base shape that if you were working in Adobe Photoshop to paint on and add the details to within this. Now, the first thing we can do is we need to figure out what color that this is so that we can get the tints and the shades of that color. With your paintbrush selected, if you hold down the Command key, you should be able to click on the object and automatically select it. Notice now you've got that color as your fill color. From here, you can actually go up and open up your color guide panel. See if we can make it a little bit larger so we can see it. I'm going to drag it off. There it is. The color guide allows you to have tints and shades and actually different hue values of whatever color that you have selected. So if I needed to get a darker color very quickly and easily, I can click up here and get a shade of that color. Just make sure you don't have that color still selected. So I'm going to click on it once, then hold down Option and click away from it, and that'll get rid of that one. Now if I wanted to quickly add that shadow back onto it, I can select the shade of it and start to use it. The other thing to remember is that since we had that as a fill color, I'm going to do Shift and X and swap that over to my stroke color. The other thing you could do is hit the little arrow right here, and that will swap between those two, but Shift X is a good one to remember. The final thing we'll do is let's go ahead and select a brush to work with. So for our brushes, we can use, let's do any of these textured brushes. Now, the more opaque ones are going to require you to drop your opacity and work a little bit more. The more translucent and transparent ones, like these watercolor brushes, will allow you to keep everything at 100% opacity. Just to make it simple for me, I'm going to choose this opaque acrylic brush, and let's give it a test at 100%. So if I tested it, this is what it's painting off as right now. So that may be a little bit too small. So I'm going to go up here to my stroke and let's make it about 3-point and test out. It's looking a little bit better. Maybe I'll go back down to 2-point as my size. The other thing I want to do is play around with my opacity. Just like in Photoshop, when we paint with a lower opacity or a lower flow rate, this will allow us to gradually build up the shadows that we have. So we're going to bring my opacity way down, anywhere between 1 and 10%. And now when I paint, you can see how it's very, very subtly adding on that color to it. Now all we're going to do to paint a basic sphere is very, very carefully paint on top of this to build up that shape. I don't even mind if I go outside the edges. I simply want to get the idea of how this looks and what color that I'm laying down. So even if I'm off by a little bit, that's okay. Now if I do make a mistake and I need to go back, this is where we'll select our mid-tone value and bring it back in. But for now, I'm simply layering on darks and darks, lights and lights as it moves around. I want it to look painterly, and I don't mind if it does go over the edge, because that's one of the styles that you may want to have. So I'm slowly building this up, and you can see it's taking several strokes just to get a good basic overlay and even a darker color. Now if I wanted to go darker quicker, I can always bump up my opacity. In this case I'm bumping it up to about 25%. And now this will give me an even darker color that I can paint in down here. Finally, I can also make my color slightly darker, as well as making this darker up here. So we don't have to go 100% black on it. I still want to see just a little bit of the green. It does help to pay attention, however, to whatever color that you're working on and what opacity that color is set in. Let's bring it back up to about 10%. Okay, with that, let's hold down Command again, click on our green. So now we've got green loaded back up, and I can deselect that. But again, we need to swap over that to our stroke color. And now when I paint, I'm going to bring my opacity back down to about 10%, 10 to 20%. If I need to push back and bring back some of that green, this is where I can paint back on top of there and pull back some of that green. It doesn't have a lovely painterly effect, all done within Adobe Illustrator. Now from here, let's get a tint of that green. Go into my color guide, got my tint selected. Notice now it's selected as my stroke color. And let's paint in the middle portion of this, the highlight portion of this, excuse me, and let it blend in with our mid-tones as well. So we don't want this to look 100% perfect. I want it to be intentionally painterly. That's the whole reason why we had this acrylic style of brush. But we are working with different parts and opacities of that. Your eye's going to do most of the blending. Maybe I'll go back up here to the opacity. Let's bring that up just a little bit more. Closer to 50%. It's going to go very light, very quickly. Bringing it down closer to 20, 25%. We'll get this look and feel too. And again, if you go too far, simply select that green again from your tone guide, and then paint back on some of the midtones that you may be missing in between here. Once you get that done, we can back out, and this will give you an idea of how that's now painted. So all of that was done just with vectors. All you have to do is to see those vectors is select them, and you can see all the different lines that it took just to paint that off. Now sometimes you do want to paint inside of the actual area that you're working on. You want to have that nice crisp clean edge inside of that shape. So there's two different ways that we can work through this. Let's do the same thing for this one as we did with the first one, and then later on we'll go back and we're going to clean up this shape. So first off, to get the color, hold down Command and click on the object. And so this should give you your fill color. I want to swap that over to my stroke color, so Shift X will swap out both of those. Now I can go in and let's get a shade of that particular blue selected. Again, grab your brush tool, and for this brush I'm going to use one of my watercolor brushes. Since the watercolor brush already has a low opacity, I can work with 100% opacity and still feel good about how it should look. Now if I test it out, you can see that's what it looks like with a 1-point stroke. Here's what it looks like with a 2-point stroke. I'm kind of liking that, so I'm going to go with this. Again, we want this to slowly build up in shadows, and if you feel like it's going too quickly, this is where you can drop down the opacity and slowly creep up on those darker values from your midtones. Once you feel confident you've got those midtones done, let's bring our opacity back up to 100% and then fill in the rest of the shadows that are down here. At this point, it's okay if you go outside of the edge. Later on, we're going to go back in and we're going to clean up that edge, so don't worry too much about that at this time. Of course, if you do make a mistake, one good thing about Illustrator is you have near infinite undos, so you can go back and you can delete everything once you get to there. Now that I've done that, let's swap over and get us a highlight color. So I've clicked on the white, and let's just kind of slowly build in some highlights by clicking and dragging and adding on those to this design. Now since this is a low opacity brush, it is going to take a lot more strokes to do this. Maybe this is the time I can swap back over to one of my more opaque or solid brushes. In this case, maybe I'll use this little brush here. Start to paint in with him. Again, there we go. Now I'm still working at 40% opacity. I could bump that up just a bit, bring down the size of it, and there it is, starting to look a little bit better. Again, bring down the opacity so that you can blend in all of those colors. Okay. Once you get something that looks a little bit better than this, maybe I can go a little bit darker on some of these darker edges. Hang on one second. Let's see if we can get the rest of them. Again, choose a darker color. In this case, it's near black. Let's see if those shadows can be pushed a little bit farther down. Bring up the opacity. Ooh, there we go. Now it's starting to get darker. And let's make our stroke a little bit larger. Again, it's okay to go off the edges because we're going to clean up those edges after a little bit. All right. I won't labor through this much longer, but you get kind of the basic idea. Now we're going to mask off this particular area. To create the mask, here's the magic trick to do. I need to carefully select the blue circle that's behind everything that's here. So with it selected, we'll go up to Edit, and we're going to copy it. Then I'm going to deselect everything. Whoops, I didn't mean to paste that. Select it again. Select your circle, go up to Edit and Copy. With it copied, we can now deselect it. Let's go up to Edit and Paste in Place. So this is going to place it right on top of everything that's already on there. So we've got a copy of it sandwiched in between, or on top of, excuse me, all of the strokes that we created, including the blue background that's behind there. The second part of the magic trick, you need to select everything that's on top of here. So with that blue circle on top, when I click and drag over all of this, you can see now that all those strokes and those lines are selected. And the final part is to go up to Object, down to Clipping Mask, and we're going to make a clipping mask out of the object that's on top of everything. In this case, it's that blue circle that we pasted. So when I choose Make, this is going to take everything and it's going to mask it off inside of that blue circle. Now you see we've got a near perfect sphere type circle inside of it. I can still select the objects and move them around, so there's no problem with that. Also, if I wanted to make any edits to this, there's two things I could do. I could go back up to Object, Clipping Mask, and release it. And this will break open that mask that we created and allow me to make edits. Or If I wanted to keep the mask still on, so we'll turn it back on, I can double click on this, double click. This will go into isolation mode, and this will allow me to select any of the lines that are there, but also allow me to keep painting on top of there. So if I wanted to add more darker lines, let's put this back up to 100%. If I wanted to paint in more inside of it, now I'm painting inside of an isolation mode that allows me the ability to do that. Just remember, once you're finished, to go back up to your layer 1, and this will take you back to your normal layer to work with this. So one way, actually go all the way back, one way you can isolate the area that you're painting in is to use a clipping mask. And by many measures, that's kind of the easiest thing to do. A final way of masking off an area is to paint inside of the objects that you've drawn off. And we're going to do that to the red one. So with the red object selected, let's go over to our Tools panel. And down towards the very bottom, you'll notice these three icons. There's Draw Normal, Draw Behind, and here's a Draw Inside. Notice that Shift D will shift between all of these different modes. When you click on Draw Inside, once you've selected an object, you'll see that it has a funny little outline, a little dotted outline on all the corners of that object. This means this object is now isolated, and whatever you paint or draw or create is going to be created inside of this shape. So with it Drawn Inside mode selected, let's go back up and select our paintbrush tool. And for this one, let's use some of our stippling or maybe your hatch brush. I'm going to use my stipple brush. With the stipple brush selected, I can test it out. Do make sure, let's change the color. So I've got the color selected. I'm going to pick one of these shades and click and drag, and that will add on that particular shade of it on top of here. Maybe I'll go even a little bit lighter with it. I think that's a pretty good size. Notice now when I paint, everything stays inside. Even if I accidentally go over the edges, this will automatically place those stippled dots inside of this area. Now the best part about the stipple dots is that I can keep the same opacity. I'm just changing the density of them in order to get a darker area. But if I needed to, I could drop the opacity, or even better, I could change up the color that I'm working in. So instead of it being such a dark red, I can let it be a little bit less or more saturated. Let's go with something like this. Finally, if I wanted to add highlights, let's add a tint to it. Grab that tint color, Jimmo. There we go. And then let's add a few more density dots up here. So there's that. Now we'll push it back. Grab the regular red as a midtone once it decides to select. There we go. Let's go back in with some midtone dots. So stippling in vector is always fun. It's always a bit of a challenge because you can't 100% precisely control it. But I'm working back and forth between midtones, highlights, and shadows to give me the results that I want. But the main thing for this technique, as far as drawing inside of it, is that you've selected the Draw Inside mode as your normal mode. To go back to normal mode, you can simply choose the normal mode down at the very bottom. Notice that the outer edge has disappeared. The downside to this is being able to select the circle sometimes is very difficult. You actually have to click on, if I was to, for instance, click right here on the circle, well, it's not actually selecting anything. This is because it's acting as the red inside of it is acting as kind of a background color, and there's no longer a circle inside of it. You actually have to carefully click on something that's on the circle, like these lines that we've created, these brush lines, in order to select the circle and to move it. So sometimes it's difficult working with this, but if you've got enough dense painting inside of it, it's easy to select. Also, when you go to scale it down, let's make sure that it also scales the contents along with it too. Yeah, we're working through well with that. Actually, let me show you that again. If I was to select this object and try to scale it down, now I'm holding Shift to make sure it's nice and proportional. Notice that the lines or the dots don't necessarily get any smaller, though they do get denser in, and my object looks very different from what I have once it's blown up. Here's what's happening. When I scale this down now, all of the size of my strokes, the width of the lines that I'm drawing, are remaining the same size. Now, if I want to scale this down and also scale my strokes, then I need to turn that object on, or option on, for scaling. Here's how to do that. Here's how to fix that problem. If you go to your Scale tool, here's the Scale tool right here. You can double click on it. And one of the options underneath the Scale tool is to tell it to scale strokes and effects. Now with that turned on, when we say OK, we can select our object and scale it down. And this will also scale all of the effects and all the stippled dots that are inside of it down proportionally as well. So very often you want to be able to do that. Let's do the same for this object. So with that one selected, whoops, when we scale it down, because we have it turned on, it should look exactly the same as the larger one. That looks good. I'm going to undo it. But if we go to our, again, Scale tool, and if you don't see the Scale tool, it's hiding underneath the Shear or the Reshape tool. But find the Scale tool and double click on it. If we turn off Scaling Strokes and Effects, and then try to scale this down, you can see how all of our strokes start to blend together and you're kind of losing some of the painterly effect that we tried to create. So very often, I'm going to undo what I just did, you definitely want to turn on Scale Strokes and Effects and have that done as well. The final thing I'll point out when working with this is because you have so many lines and so much detail within these objects, sometimes your computer will start to bog down and run a little bit slow. This kind of painting within vector objects is very memory intensive. So make sure when you're working on this exercise and any other projects in Illustrator that you don't have too many other projects or windows or applications running in the background. You only want to have Adobe Illustrator and whatever else is necessary to work on this project open. Now for the remainder of this exercise, I want you to paint in the rest of these objects in a correct form, creating 3D forms with each one of these. And I want you to practice each of the different 3 techniques that we tried. Now I'm going to leave this up to you how you want to paint it and what technique you want to try, as long as one of these objects is you're painting on top of, one of these objects you're using the clipping mask technique, and the other object you're using the paint inside of technique. And you can pick and choose which one you want. Also, I'll allow you to use your same custom brushes that you used and created from the previous exercise, as long as it's appropriate and you can adjust it as necessary. So using these stipple or hatch brushes would be good. Any one of your art brushes or even your bristle brushes would be appropriate to use for this exercise. So I'm going to leave it up to you how you want to paint it and which one you want to do, as long as it has good highlights and shadows within the form and the forms are correctly rendered. You do not have to do any kind of cast shadow onto the ground, so simply stick to the form shadows and highlights within each of the different forms. Once you are finished with this, you can go up to File, and let's do a Save As, and then make sure to add your name to the beginning of that, and you can save it as an Adobe Illustrator file. When you hit Save, it's going to ask you for your options, and you can keep it the default options to save from here. This Adobe Illustrator file is what you're going to upload to Moodle once you finish.